Hello and welcome to episode 38 of the Medical Device Success podcast and videocast. I am Ted Newell, your host. Thank you very much for spending time with us today. I'm very excited to announce that this is the first of many episodes called In the C-Suite. Yes, I have interviewed a lot of C-Suite executives in the past 37 episodes. However, these interviews tend to be focused on the companies and their technologies and how they related to helping out during the pandemic. While we cover some of those same issues with these upcoming episodes, we also explore what it takes to be a C-suite leader, what has shaped and influenced them, and how they have responded to these extraordinary times during the pandemic. Do you know what the mother, daughter, sister, grandmother test is? Today, Trevor McCaw, CCO at TriSalus Life Sciences, will answer that question. It has to do with values. Trevor joins us to talk about this groundbreaking technology, the steps in his career to the C-suite, career advice, why he chose the medical device industry, challenges, and his leadership response during the pandemic. Trevor is a member of the MedTech Leaders Community. By the way, I'm the host of the MedTech Leaders Community. You can learn more about this non-LinkedIn community at medtechleaders.net. This is where a lot of the videocasts reside. I do have a YouTube channel you can find under Medical Device Success, and I will be making some of the older, yet still applicable videocasts public on that YouTube channel soon. If you are interested in the MedTech Leaders Community, there is a 30-day free trial. Again, more information at medtechleaders.net. All right, let's get together with Trevor for a very interesting conversation. Trevor, it's really terrific to have you on the program today, and thank you so much for being the first in this series that I'm calling In the C-Suite, because I think it's really important. And but again, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, no, thank you. Honored.
Well, what's interesting is, and we do have this attendee who I'll probably also interview because he's a CEO. But as I've started to set these up and started to talk about people in the C-suite and start talking to them, what's really fascinating is what a wide variety of circumstances everybody is in. And you're in a really interesting circumstance, and you have a really interesting history. And so what I'd like to start off with, if you don't mind, is just give us a brief description of TriSalus Life Sciences and your role there.
Yeah, absolutely. So TriSalus is a company that started off as a medical device company developing catheters for oncology procedures. And it's evolved in the last couple of years, since 2018, to really become much more than that. And we're in the midst of developing a smart valve platform, which is a device approach to modulate the pressure around a tumor, and then use that modulation and use the delivery mechanism to deliver therapeutics to the tumor, to treat the tumor. Today, we deal with conventional therapeutics. There's radioembolics, chemoembolics, but we really see that as a springboard to what we're going to be doing in the future, which is immuno-oncology. So think of it as a way to kind of deliver therapies very specific, very locally. We call it local regional. And it gets over a lot of the side effects and increases the benefit versus what's traditionally delivered systemically. So IV bag, needle, we really go right to the tumor and deliver the therapy there. My role as Chief Commercial Officer, I have responsibility for all the sales and marketing, the revenue focus on the device business. And we have another team that's focused on the immuno-oncology therapeutic business, which we licensed and purchased late summer last year.
Okay. That's great. And later in the program, I do want to come back to the technology because there's some very fascinating aspects to it. But
Absolutely.
For our listeners, what I'd like to do is start a little bit with your career, because I think it's always interesting. How does somebody get to the C-suite, and what motivates them to get there. And I noticed, like in your background, you went right from engineering school. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you went right into Boston Consulting Group.
Yep.
So
Yep.
is this something that was in your DNA? I mean, how did you know you're going to go from engineering into Boston Consulting Group? Not only consulting, but that's almost like a segue into new ventures and so on.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So it really comes down to, I went into engineering because I was good at math and science and didn't know what else to do. And I thought, engineering looks about as good as anything else. So that's kind of how I landed in engineering. I didn't go in wanting to be an engineer. I wasn't kind of one of those hardwired people. But what really struck me was I looked around my class and I saw people who like did engineering in their spare time. These were guys and women in the weekends who were like building computers and doing this stuff. They loved it. They had a passion for it that I didn't. I got good grades. Like I was certainly on par with them academically, but I wasn't wired for it. And that kind of opened my eyes to say, I'm not going to be the best engineer in the room. That's clear. I mean, these people live and breathe it and think it. So I really looked to what else I wanted to do. And I interviewed with the investment banks in New York. I interviewed with the consulting companies. I kind of went broad and wide as an exploration. And I fell in love with the management consulting model. It puts you in a room with a bunch of smart people. You got to go experience a whole lot of different industries really quickly. And I got sucked in. And I love the culture of Boston Consulting Group. And that's what really took me there. I had a real keen interest in healthcare right out of engineering, right out of undergrad. I took all the pre-med classes, actually applied to med school and decided not to go. So I had this I had this desire to go into healthcare, but it took a while for that kind of blurry vision to start to become clear. So I started in Boston Consulting Group. Then it was the dot-com day. You could do no wrong if you knew electrical computer engineering. So then I went into software and started a software company. So I was kind of the early part of my career, but it became very evident quickly that I wanted to get into healthcare. I wasn't equipped to do it as with my existing skill set, and that's why I went back to do my MBA. And I always describe it as kind of hitting the reset button. I went into MBA not knowing what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to come out the other end in healthcare.
But you still had a great foundation, Boston Consulting Group, starting your own business, engineering. My wife is a retired ER doctor, but she was an engineer before she went to med school. Yeah. My dad was an engineer, so I'm the son of an engineer, which is really dangerous. But it was great in helping me understand technologies, because he's one of those guys where you're in the basement and you'd say, Dad, what's this? And how does it work? And he'd say, well, how do you think it works?
Yeah.
Before you know it, you're in this whole cycle of, figuring things out. So no, I get it. I understand that. And so you hit the reset, went to Harvard for their program. What specifically was that program again?
General MBA. So at Harvard, the MBA class is all general. First year, you take everything, or everybody takes the same thing. So it's very general.
And then to stick your feet into the medical business, you went to work for Medtronic.
I did. Yeah, I came out, and this is funny because I earlier said I wasn't an engineer, but when I looked at cross healthcare, you look at insurance companies, providers, biotech, and you look across everything, and the only thing I innately understood was medtech. You could hold it, you could touch it, you could bend it, twist it, push it, and so I guess it was partly I was drawn to it because medtech went back to some of that engineering roots, and I really liked it. And there were other things. I like the time frames. Like some of the pharma time frames scared me back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
1 in 10,000 drugs make it, and it takes 17 years. I was like, life's too short. I don't want to start off there. And then the other elements had a lot of bureaucracy, which I was not necessarily enamored with either, having worked with some of these big companies at BCG. So I kind of fell into medtech, and I knew through kind of reaching out that if you want to be in medtech, one of the best paths to go is to Medtronic. And I really looked at it as kind of, I often described it to friends as Medtronic University. Like I went there and I was a sponge. Like I just absorbed everything at Medtronic. And it was phenomenal place to start off. I mean, the other ones would be too, Boston Scientific, J&J, all of those, Abbott. I'm sure they're all great, but I fell in love with Medtronic. I couldn't imagine a better kind of corporate steward and place to start off a career. And it has played out. I mean, as I look back and reflect 20 years ago, how much that Medtronic knowledge, but also community I always think it's fine. If I'm reaching out to somebody, I often describe it as Medtronic refugee wants to connect. I mean, it really does have that strong connection that's on par with my Harvard connection. I'm a big fan of that Medtronic experience. So the question around leadership and how do you get to the C-suite, I think if you don't come from the industry, if you're not a doctor or something, I think it's really going to those big companies is good. You learn how things are done well. They do a lot of things right, and kind of getting that imprinted early on for me, and I've seen it among my peers as mission critical. Now, if I look across my peers today that are in the C-suite, I almost every single one of them had a path through one of the big medtech companies.
Yeah, I started with American Hospital Supply, but a really small division.
Right.
That was like only $30 million in this $3 billion company. So you got like the best of both worlds. But I'd like to put in a big exclamation point on what you just said from a career standpoint to listeners. I frequently hear young people today say, well, when I get out of school, I'd like to find a small company to work for and help them build up and do this and do that. And I always say, go get a job with a real big company, prove that you can survive there, prove that you can get promoted there. First of all, just getting recruited is proof of something because they typically have pretty, you know, rigorous recruiting standards, but go work for a company like that and learn exactly what you learned, Trevor, because they got great programs. They've got great training. They set great examples, great processes and systems that you learn. I agree with you 100%.
And to build on that, one of the things I tell people when I'm giving the same kind of advice to folks is go to a big company and get as close to the customer as you can. These are huge companies. You can be 5 or 6 degrees away from a customer. Even if you want to be in HR, finance, IT, even if you want to be in one of those different functional areas, I recommend everybody go get as close to the customer as possible. In hindsight, I would have loved to take a field sales job. I mean, I think that's ultimately, like, at the end of the day, the rubber hits the road when you put a device in the hands of a clinician and they treat a patient. And honestly, everything else trickles down from that. And I think you see a lot of people miss that. And I got kind of close to it. I would have loved to have been even closer, but that's something I often counsel people to is get as close to that final customer, patient, physician as you can, because it just serves you so well no matter where you end up in the rest of the industry. Looking back to that is instrumental and fundamental in terms of your understanding of the industry.
Right. So your point is, like, if you had a chance to be in sales for at least a period of time, you are directly facing the customer.
Yeah.
And so to do that within the industry you want to be in is great. I agree with you. I mean, you are a salesperson because you just look at your career. You've been selling your ideas and your concepts and businesses your entire career. So you're a salesperson. There's no question.
Yeah.
But the point is, in the area that you're specializing, get close to the customer because so much you can learn. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then, when it comes to if we talk about again getting into the C-suite, what part of your personality, skills, and or experience do you think sort of add up to being in the C-suite? Because being a salesperson, you have pressure on you. You've got quotas to hit, you've got expectations and so on and so forth, but you're sort of sitting there and you're expecting the company to deliver the support that you need. But when you're in the C-suite, you're sort of up there all alone. So what do
Yeah.
you think it takes to be there?
Well, one, it's a desire to have the job. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent of a company of having a strategy and a vision. So, I mean, you find people who end up there by mistake, not by mistake, that's the wrong term. They end up there without the deliberate focus to be there. You get promoted, and suddenly one day you're in the C-suite and you're like, oh, this isn't necessarily what I wanted to do. So I think the most important thing is understand their role and want to do it. And I would argue a meaningful number of people who are in this role shouldn't be because they don't want to do it. They don't like the stress. They don't like the weight. They don't like you don't get your hands dirty every day. Like, I think there's a lot of people. So really know what it is and make sure you want it. Like, it's kind of that thing, make sure you don't wish for something you don't want, right? I think that's a big part of it. And I've always wanted this. Like, I really like the role. One of the things I think about my life is leverage. And one of the reasons I didn't become a doctor is I didn't want to treat patient by patient by patient. I want to treat thousands and tens of thousands and millions of patients. And so one of the things that drives me to the C-suite is that leverage, your ability to leverage impact across your team and across a wide array. So I think that's kind of philosophically one of the things you have to understand. And then it's just lining up the functional skills. I think you have to become, you never want to become the master of anything, but you want to become competent in a lot of different things. So you have to be able to know how to read a balance sheet. You have to know how to look at an engineering drawing. You have to look, and this is across all the C's, like CFO, COO, CEO, these apply to all of them. You have to develop kind of competency in a lot of those key areas, but most importantly, leadership. I mean, you have to rally a team and motivate people to get there. I wouldn't say, I think I knew I wanted to be there. I didn't know the journey. So it wasn't a deliberate, like, do step one, then step two, then step three. I think it was more building the foundation, making sure I got those competencies, and really knowing that ultimately I wanted to put them into action as a C level. And then the other thing is confidence. If you know you want to be there, if you've got the core competencies, it's a belief that you can do it. And I will tell you, it's never like what you expected. And if you don't believe you can do it, it doesn't matter how good you are at those first two, you're going to flounder. So I think confidence is a big component of it. You have to, it sounds cliche, but you kind of have to believe in yourself and believe that you'll be good in that role.
But then the confidence is also a result of everything you've done in the past to some degree, but then there's this extra edge that you have to have as an individual.
Right. Yeah. I think you have to be able to compartmentalize the job. The stress and the burden of having anybody in the C-suite, it can sink you personally, and you have to be able to compartmentalize things like, worry about the things you control, don't worry about the things you can't. Like, some of that kind of ability to deal with the stresses and focus and really make a difference in the areas you can is another key component of it. And that's where I think you get that edge. I think it's people who can do that well, are well suited for the C-suite.
And this isn't your first C-suite job. You've had several, but if you look at this, and even look at past roles and with other organizations, is there any particular challenge that you had to overcome that was very representative of being in the C-suite and having to use that leverage and use that leadership that you could talk to?
Yeah, I'll think back to my days when I was at a company called Blueprint Clinical. We were as close to a garage startup as you can imagine, just coders sitting on chairs we picked up at the dump kind of thing. One of the challenges that I came to appreciate was the challenge of selling into big organizations in healthcare. So I was singing the praises of healthcare earlier in the accolades. There's a darker side of healthcare too, which is it's bureaucratic and slow and risk averse in a lot of cases. And it can get really frustrating as a small company where you've got a product that you believe makes a difference. You've got external validation that it's working, and you're hitting this kind of organizational inertia that's preventing it from getting out there. And, I literally remind myself every day about the patient. I think about it as I'm like, are we doing good by the patient? And if we are, kind of everything else, you should make our decisions around that. There are obviously other things that factor into it. But one of the challenges I had was dealing with that bureaucracy and just kind of how you sell into, we were selling into big pharma, kind of top 10 pharma companies. And I'd come from the medtech world and I knew that area. But the challenge I had was just, I describe it as at one point I must have had a flat head. The front of my head must have been flat from banging against the wall. And the challenge was I wasn't prepared for it. Well, I didn't know it was going to happen. I wasn't prepared for it. And by the time I realized how big the hill was to climb, I wasn't equipped to do it. And so we kind of ended up in a spot where we had a success. The company was a success, but it could have been a much bigger success. And I just under-resourced and underappreciated how hard it was to sell into it. And it was on me. It was on me and my partner to know that, and we didn't know that adequately enough. And I think it, if I reflect back, as one of my frustrations is We should have hired more people, raised more money, done all of those things to kind of buy ourselves more time to go into the pharma world with selling into pharma, knowing clear what it should have been, or what it could have been, and what it should have been.
But even the hospital systems can be real bureaucratic messes to get into. And I was talking to another CEO earlier this week that we're getting set up for a similar interview, part of the C-suite series, and she was saying that she didn't realize the kind of inertia that there is in the hospital ecosystem and how hard it is to break into that, break through that inertia to bring a new concept to bear and to get people to accept it. There's so many other things people are dealing with, and it's just hard to change habits. So you're right. It's, you do need to make sure you've got runway to take off on, for sure.
Yeah, and in our case, our customers were looking for it was very much a CYA environment. They were looking for some sort of external validation from the FDA or another big competitor. No one wanted to move first. Everybody thought being different means my job's on the line. If I'm wrong, I don't get fired for status quo. I guess that was kind of the feeling I ran into. And I wasn't used to that. I was used to people thriving by innovating and finding new ways to do things. And in this particular segment, it took me a long time to realize that you were rewarded for steady state stasis, not changing, and that the risk was really in changing. And that was kind of an insight. If I think back of the challenge that I had to overcome, and no better now, that would have been one of them.
Okay, so here we are. It's 2020. And you're, early mid-year, you're at a totally different job. You're not at TriSalus yet. Probably hadn't even seen TriSalus on the horizon yet. And then suddenly they're there and they're recruiting you. What motivated you to join TriSalus? Because you were happy at the other job you had.
I was, absolutely. So for me, the pandemic I feel so gracious and lucky that it wasn't a huge driver in my life. I was working from home. My wife worked from home. We were kind of lucky that we were not rabbled by COVID the same way a lot of other people were. So I wasn't retrenched and kind of thinking about the pandemic as a big external factor. And I recognize I'm extremely lucky to have been in that camp. So I didn't have this kind of external pressure. So for me, it was just regular course of business that I connected with TriSalus. What really triggered me to join TriSalus was a couple things. One, I've always been fascinated with this intersection between device and pharma. I maybe couldn't articulate it as well as I can now, but I always knew that pharma lived in this silo and medtech lived in this silo, and they were both equally arrogant and wrong in the fact that the cross-pollination makes sense. And we've seen it. Like, there was drug-eluting stents. There are examples of this, but it's not as pervasive as it should have been. And I always, was drawn to it and always thought, you have these two amazing approaches. Why not put them together? And I love that TriSalus was doing that. That's what sucked me in initially. And then our CEO, Mary, she's unbelievable. She's this inspirational leader. She has this vision that kind of created this intersection. And I hadn't seen that in the industry in a while. Somebody who came from pharma but had embraced the medtech side. And that was what really drew me in. I really wanted to be part of it. I think to me, it's kind of like electric cars. It's not a matter of if it's going to be the future. It's just a matter of how and when and how it unfolds. The intersection between device and pharma is going to be and it's going to be a big part of the future. And I wanted to be part of it. I don't know how it's going to unfold. I think we're going to be a meaningful part of it, but I knew I wanted to develop that skill set. And so that was a big part of what drew me in.
And from the conversations you and I had before, there was a personal element here too.
Yes. So I had a business partner at another company that I had started, actually not MedTech company, who was diagnosed with a solid tumor on his adrenal gland when he was 39. His name was Doug Burgoyne, and he passed away 9 months after getting diagnosed. And Doug was such an interesting example where Doug was one of the fittest people I knew. Like, he did everything right. He ate all organic. He was fit. he had it all together, and then he got diagnosed, and it wiped him out so quickly. And so I've always been touched by that. And like I said about the intersection between the device and the pharma, I've also always been intrigued with oncology. It was a little bit daunting because I didn't fully understand it early on, but I did have that personal motivation. And I've always I think of Doug often, thinking, man, if he was 10 years later, what I'm working on might have actually made a difference for him. And he left behind, two young boys, I think 3 and 18 months. And so it's gut wrenching to think that happened to somebody who it shouldn't have. When you're 89 and you get cancer, we want to treat those patients, no question.
Sure.
But when you see a 39-year-old father of 2 young boys, it completely reframed it in my mind. And so that was a big motivator.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. But those kinds of things, motivate a lot of us, and a lot of people are in medtech for, similar reasons. But you do feel good when your products are going to make a difference. And these TriSalus Life Science products, well, the combination, we're going to talk about that here soon. The combination platform, not combination device. Combination
Right. Yeah.
So we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, so now, okay, you're on board. It's the fall of 2020, and you're on board at TriSalus Life Sciences. Like, what are some of the first challenges you face as a chief commercial officer coming on board?
Interestingly, I said COVID kind of didn't rattle my personal life. It certainly rattled a small company trying to do a launch. It was the exact opposite. I mean, the company they launched the product in February of 2020. I mean, can you imagine a worse time to be trying to come out with a brand new product, brand new reimbursement code, brand new sales organization? So as you'd expect, it didn't meet expectations on January 31st. What they thought the year was going to look like didn't play out. And it wasn't, what the hard thing was, it wasn't a fault of the product or the team. It was external circumstances. So I kind of came in, recognizing that the world was different than what the expectation was. So it was a heavy lift. There was a lot of work to be done to try and get the product back on track. And with that COVID came a lot of chaos, partnerships, team, a lot of confusion. So for me, all at the same time, I'm trying to learn a new therapeutic area. So I was sitting down hours on YouTube watching immuno-oncology videos, trying to read through research papers on metastatic metastatic disease, etc. So it was kind of a month of, like I said earlier, sponge, like just absorb as much as I can so I can talk credibly, and then map out the future really quickly. Like, how do we get out of this kind of chaos of COVID and right the ship? And the hospitals had restricted access to sales reps. The value assessment committee processes were in a lot of cases ground to a halt. So a lot of it was trying to figure out what was going on and then put in place a plan to fix it. So the first few months were very much reflective and trying to understand and get a sense of what we had in front of us. And then we've been in a building phase ever since. We've been building out our team. We've been putting in place a lot of new marketing, sales programs, et cetera. So it's certainly has shifted from fall of 2020 to now, kind of looking forward, and tremendous level of excitement. We've seen the effects of COVID probably level off and probably even get better. I think the hospitals, even though the numbers are still there, the hospitals have figured out how to grapple with COVID, and we're not back to the old world. I'm not sure we ever will get back to the old world, but at least we're in a little bit more of a steady state than we were before.
Yeah, the CDC just came out with its new quarantine guidance for people that have been vaccinated, and it's not going to help MedTech because it's you have a window from the second week after your second shot. That's when they consider you vaccinated, that it's effective. For a 3-month period, if you're exposed to somebody that has COVID, during that 3-month period, you would not have to quarantine. But after that 3-month period is over, 3 months from that second week after your second shot, you would have to quarantine again. So I think that kind of guidance is still going to rattle our ability to get in front of doctors, to get into hospitals, and so on and so forth. And there's going to be some challenges for some time to come. So tell me, like, can you just generally describe a couple strategies or tactics you used on the marketing and or sales side to try to right the ship and or steady the ship in this COVID environment?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two that kind of stand out. One is engaging the physicians from a marketing and sales level, kind of one-on-one. So rather than, I mean, I'll use the example of conferences, right? You can't put a booth up and be in front of 2,000 or 5,000 people anymore with a low touch but high, wide awareness. We've had to shift towards very focused engagement with the customers, and we're doing it both digitally, traditionally, and in person. So we've gone from shotgun to laser. So that's the first thing. And as part of that, we're really using physicians as a conduit for that. So finding champions, finding KOLs, and enabling them. I would argue we're kind of, in a lot of cases tapped out in some of the digital. I mean, we're all sitting in front of a computer more than we did before. The physicians are the same way. Like, a lot of the face-to-face engagement has been replaced by computer engagement, even in their internal stuff, department meetings, all that kind of stuff. It's all been replaced with Zoom calls. So we're treading lightly in terms of how to engage digitally, but it certainly has become a big part of it. And then for us, another big part of the strategy was you can't sit by the scrub sink and wait for cases to happen as much as you used to be able to. That kind of, if you look back in the last 50 years, a significant percentage of medtech business came from being there, physically being in the room. I mean, we've all walked the halls of hospitals and seen reps like one after another in their scrubs and their fleece vests lined up waiting for cases. That's changed. I think we have to be much more strategic. Not to say we can't. We need to be there. There needs to be a physical presence, but the rules have changed such that we need to react and adapt to that. So we're looking at new ways of engaging schedulers, engaging physicians, engaging lab staff. That's a little bit less, I want to say, more proactive rather than reactive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great. So did that end up requiring a number of like strategic meetings with your team to sort
Oh
this
yeah,
stuff out, to design new sales processes?
all of the above. We're rewriting the entire sales process. So we're moving. We've restructured how we do some of the distributor agreements. We're leaning more heavily on direct reps. We're looking for folks who kind of have probably deeper experience than maybe we would before. We've kind of raised the bar in terms of what we want the team to be. It's a little bit of a less is more, right? We'd rather have a really strong rock star sales rep than maybe 2 or 3 junior reps that don't have the experience. This new world requires relationships. It requires an understanding of the process. It's hard to learn from the outside looking in. So we're really looking for people who've kind of been in that environment and can translate that experience out. The other big thing is with us, with the transitional pass-through payment, the TPT code. It's not that common. I mean, it's a very powerful tool that CMS put in place to bring novel, meaningful technologies forward and remove one of the barriers, which is reimbursement. It's wonderful. It's a great program. It's helping patients, but it's not everywhere. And so, kind of the reimbursement part of the story is something that we're telling, and it's not always told to the clinician. It's told to an administrator, a lab staff, a revenue cycle management person. So we're being very thoughtful about that reimbursement story and how we tell that as well, which is critical in this time and age, especially where some of the value assessment committees have slowed down.
And when you talk about the sales rep and needing, you're looking for pretty sharp people that also have some relationships that you can work from, which is critical, especially with like a newer technology. But do you also find that the skill set might be a little bit different? I mean, not only do you need a rock star, but you need somebody that can actually set up I don't know whether you use Zoom, but a virtual call. Let's just say set up a virtual call, have the skills to be able to coordinate 1 or 2 other people that might participate in that call. Have you found that the profile of the individuals changed a little bit?
Yeah, yes. I think there's 2 elements to that. One is the technology to enable it. So, I mean, I think almost anyone can set up a Zoom call now. I mean,
Yeah.
that's become common. I mean, rewind 12 months, that wasn't the case. But I think now that the kind of fundamentals are in place in most areas. What's missing is how do you use it strategically? When do you use it? How long is it? What are the right touch points? That we're working on. And in fact, we're talking about bringing on specific skill sets that only focus on that. So think of it as, in your old world, you'd have a PR person or you might have a social media person. Well, we're entering a world where you need to have a virtual person. I don't know what the right title is, but you need somebody who is on top of the technologies, knows the right cadence, knows how to structure the meetings, how to hit record and not forget, like whatever. I mean, that's just one example, but that is a skill set that we want to bring to bear. I don't think most of the reps have depth in that area, but they're comfortable, working it. And then the other element is the technology. So it's beyond Zoom. There's so many other tools. How do you integrate it? I mean, the one that's top of mind because we're talking about this week is how do you integrate that into the CRM system? How do you have it so that your CRM system is driving that virtual experience as much as just being, again, kind of proactive versus reactive? How do you get your CRM system integrated with the virtual element of engaging with customers? So, in the old day, you'd send out an email, some automated triggered email. Well, now we've got to bring in how do we virtually meet with folks and how do we have all the rules and processes and requirements in place such that that can happen.
Right. So using the CRM system and perhaps some marketing automation tools to help drive people into the top of the funnel and keep getting the right kind of message to them until a sales rep can take over. Is that what you're talking about?
A little bit, but even farther down the funnel. I mean, even after they're using the tool and keeping it top of mind, it's engaging with the physicians that follow up. I mean, when they do the procedure, what's happening with that patient 30 days, 60 days, 90 days later? So it's a lot more than that. It's also refreshing clinical data. We're out building case studies and images and clinical studies. How do we bring that back to bear with the clinicians who, let's say, I'm making this up, let's say a clinician has pigeonholed the technology into using it in 1 of 5 patients. Well, maybe that doesn't make sense. Maybe they should be using it in 4 of 5 patients. Or let's say they're really comfortable with it in liver, and we know it can work in other areas, renal, bone cancer, prostate cancer. We have indications to use it elsewhere. So it's really up and down the funnel. And I would argue it's actually more back end loaded than front end loaded. It's more around, once we've got that initial communication with the clinician, how do we use those virtual tools to stay engaged over time?
So are you saying that you might use the CRM system to create, as one of the people I interviewed a month or two ago, create a journey? So that Dr. Jones is using it for liver metastases, okay, but he's been reluctant to use it in a couple other applications. So the system knows that he uses it in liver metastases, and because of that, and the system knows he's reluctant in the others, so now he's going to get a stream of messages maybe once a week or once every couple of weeks that say, hey, did you know about this? Or here's something that's interesting,
Right.
Whatever.
Yeah, and another example would be there's 4 interventional radiologists at a hospital, and one's doing all livers and the other's doing all prostate. Get a lunch and learn, bring the 2 of them together. Say, hey, Dr. Smith is doing liver metastases and you're doing prostate. Collaborate. Talk about why the smart pressure-enabled drug delivery makes sense, or can we use it in different platforms, different anatomies? So it's really kind of fostering that collaboration in some respects. We're not there today, and this is where we're headed. But yeah, the goal is to really use the data to understand the behaviors and then use this virtual engagement to help kind of shape and drive adoption. At the end of the day, we believe the technology is better for the patient, and we want to make sure that the physicians are aware of the data we have and the opportunity to use the technology in a broad set. Start with the bullseye, start with the patient that is the obvious kind of low-hanging fruit, and then how do you broaden beyond that?
So to support that, then marketing has a pretty big role here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, because we're kind of this drug and device company, as pharma is more heavily invested in marketing traditionally. We're moving in that direction. We're trying to take the best of both worlds. We're trying to take the best of what pharma does from a marketing standpoint and the best of what medtech does and kind of blend them together. It's a big priority for us because of, well, one, because we're headed down a path of eventually getting into immuno-oncology. So again, we have to have one eye to the future of, we're not just a device company with a platform smart valve. We're also looking at how do we build that foundation so that we can be successful in the immuno-oncology space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that whole area is really fascinating because,
It
as
is.
you've probably heard me say before, medtech is terrible traditionally, especially small to medium-sized companies, terrible at marketing, and COVID, really made that quite obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, okay, so let's talk about this platform. So it's called a PEDD, a pressure-enabled drug delivery a device. That's the device part of it. And then we've talked about being a combination platform, because when you and I first talked, I said combination device, and you said, no, it's not a device, it's a platform, which is really unusual and rare and interesting. And then I understood it after we talked about it for a second. So um, talk about the difference between a combination platform and a combination device.
Yeah, so when I think of a combination device, it's a drug and a device that are inextricably linked together somehow, right? Like, let's use a drug-eluting stent. The drug is bound to and coated onto that stent. There's no permutations, right? This drug, this stent, they go together. To me, that's a combination device. We have a very different approach. We have a platform device technology and a whole world of therapeutics that can be used with this with this device platform. And then umbrella on top of that is experience and data to drive that. So you can think of our platform as somewhat agnostic to the therapy. It's not in actuality, but you can almost think of it as that. Kind of on day one, it's agnostic. So you can put, in our case, you can put chemoembolics, radioembolics, bland beads. And we're moving to a world where you can put cellular therapies, immuno-oncology therapies, even traditional chemotherapies through the same platform. Now, how it works over time, the therapies behave differently, and there's an understanding of how to optimize that. But we are very much not inextricably linked to one particular therapy. And that's really how I separate it in my mind, is we've got, I mean, we're I hate to make this analogy, but we're more like a syringe, right? You can put anything through a given syringe. We're kind of a much, much better version of that, and we're somewhat agnostic to that therapy. Now, there are bounds on it. There are certain things that we don't think will work well, and we haven't tested against it. But this platform of, we can put this catheter with the smart valve in local regionally. We can put it right near the tumor. We can modulate that pressure with the pressure-enabled drug delivery with the smart valve. And with that, and understanding how that works, and the physiologic response to it, and the pressure modulation, we can effectively deliver any one of those therapies through the platform. So that's kind of the way I think about it. I'm not saying I didn't really see that anywhere else. I've kind of formulated that thought in my own mind. But when we look at it of the flexibility and the ways that our smart valve can be used, it looks more like a platform than it does a combination device. And I think that's how we want to be treated, both from a regulatory standpoint, from a customer standpoint, and also internally. We don't necessarily want to say this is linked to this and there's no other paths or options.
So one thing I want the listeners to understand is that TriSalus currently has on the market these pressure-enabled drug delivery smart valve products, and they're selling them. And like you said, they're a sort of agnostic. People can use this technology for delivering whatever they want to deliver. That's I guess standard of care at the moment. On the other side, which is really exciting for TriSalus, is you have your own pipeline of drugs that you're bringing to bear that will end up being delivered by the technology that's currently on the market, the medical device technology.
Right. Yeah, so we have a strategic hypothesis that there are a number of drugs that failed, not because the drug didn't work, but because they were delivered inappropriately.
Right.
So if you think of systemic delivery, IV bag, needle, you're treating a single tumor in a liver, but guess where that drug is going? Through the entire body. Now, there are lots of mechanisms to make a propensity for that drug to migrate to and treat that tumor, and that's fine, but it still is a systemic delivery. We kind of take the opposite approach, which is put the drug right where it needs to be. And that's that's really what we do. It's local regional. Going right up against the tumor, right beside the vascular bed of the tumor, and delivering the therapy through that means. And so that's, when we think about the big difference. And so why does that matter? So one, in order to get efficacy, a lot of cases you have to jack up the dose so that you end up with safety issues and side effects, right? So we might be, in some cases, we might get the same effect with a better safety profile and lower side effects. The other side is we can't get the dose high enough, so we don't get efficacy before we hit safety issues. In that case, we can lower the dose significantly, put it right up against the tumor, and get efficacy again without having the side effects and the complications. So we're enabled to kind of come at it from two different areas: either lower the dose and put it where it needs to be, or keep the dose the same, or lower the dose and not have to have the systemic issues, not have to have all the systemic effects. So it's one of those things where it just intuitively makes sense, right? You build it, you have a therapeutic to treat a tumor. Why not put it right in front of the tumor? And through our tool, through our pressure-enabled drug delivery, we're able to overcome the forces that are resisting the drug uptake in tumors. If you actually tease out what's going on in a tumor, it's a crazy environment. It's hypoxic, it's high pressure. You've got this disorganized kind of jumbled mess of vascular. It's hard to get the drug there, and the data supports that. When we can get up close and really use modulated pressure, we can get the drug not only to the tumor, but we can get it to get inside the tumor, cross the endoluminal barrier between the vascular and the tumor, and get that therapy right into the tumor where it needs to go to work.
And I didn't realize that the tumor, I've always known that tumors are difficult to attack. I thought it was more of an external surface related issue until I went to your website and I studied everything on the website, preparing for this. And it just makes sense. I just didn't realize the tumor was such a difficult environment from the inside out even. And that's where the pressure enabled approach makes a big difference, because where other people have tried to take treatments directly to the tumor without pressure enablement, they have not done so well. But with pressure enablement, like you said, you overcome some of these internal barriers of moving the therapy into the tumor where it can actually attack it.
Yeah, it's a physics problem. It's a physics problem of trying to push water uphill, right? You have to be able to have the pressure to overcome it, or else it doesn't work. And it doesn't matter what convection you have or what propensity you build at a molecular level. If you can't overcome the physics of it, it kind of doesn't matter. And this is not new knowledge. This is the other thing. Like, there are papers that are back in the 50s that talk about the tumor microenvironment and how pressure is high and how it's a tough environment. It's just taken a while for, again, what I talked about earlier is the pharma live in the silo and the medtech live in the silo.
Yeah.
And unfortunately with that, no one put it together, and it's taken a while. But I think we're starting to build that understanding of what you need to do to cross that tumor environment. And it's exciting.
It really is. It's really, really cool. When I was going through the website and also the conversations you and I had, and I started to really put all this stuff together, you realize how powerful this can all be. So it's very, very exciting.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And so, having been through, where you've been through so far in your previous C-suite experiences, and now this experience at TriSalus, you're working your way through the challenges of COVID, also new team members, this kind of technology. Any particular kernels of advice that you would give to other people that are, facing similar challenges?
Yeah. So if I think about it from in the world we live in, where you're bringing pharma and device, traditional pharma and device together, I think it's a recognition that it's a lot harder to do, but the benefits far outweigh the cost. If it's twice as hard to do, the benefits are 5 times greater. So I think anyone getting into this realm needs to appreciate that it is hard, but it's worth it. I guess that's kind of the one thing. It's also hard to do at a small scale. Like, this is really hard to do in a garage, part-time. These are big, hairy issues that we're tackling, and it's next to impossible to do on a small scale. So from an industry standpoint, I'm unbelievably excited about where we are. I hope lots of people look at how do we use device and drugs to treat all kinds of problems. I mean, the list of things that are ailments beyond oncology. I mean, they're just, to me, I look at the top 50 procedures in the United States, and I get excited that there are 45 of those that it's not that hard to imagine that you can bring the therapeutic and the device world together to solve some problems. So I think there's just a ton of opportunity. I don't know if that's kind of what your question was heading down, but that to me is, we need to get there as an industry. We need to collaborate better with our colleagues on the other side of the table, on the pharma side, and as an industry, I think we're going to be well served to do that. Specifically in terms of the C-suite, I think it's just, I mean, for me, it's just keep the patient in mind. How do we treat the most patients? I always use the mother, sister, daughter, grandmother test. I don't know why I picked those four, but we really need to be thinking about what would we want one of those people to do and have available. And I look at it as leverage, like I said earlier. Like, the way I'm going to treat the most grandmothers, the most sisters, the most moms is, we need to get out there and make a big difference, and give the physicians are, I mean, they're the ones, we are assistants to them, right? We are providing them tools. We're giving them the pen to write the novel, but without the pen, they can't write the novel. And that's really the way I think about it. I want to give these physicians the best tools they can to teach those patients. And at least in this industry, I hope we all hop out of bed in the morning to do that. And I really think that's what makes you happy in the C-suite. And like I talked about earlier, compartmentalizing the challenges and stuff. One way to do that is to say, let's not forget why we're here. Let's not forget why we're doing this. And so, I think if you're not answering that question, maybe I will tell you, there are lots of other industries that are easier than this one. Like, don't be in the C-suite of medtech or pharma or this if you're not in it for the patients, because it's harder than others. And I know that. I mean, I know lots of people in other areas. I don't want to diminish it. There are very different challenges, but this is a hard world to live in, and I think we've got to kind of keep that patient in mind to get, not to get through, but to keep us driving in the right direction.
Stay motivated.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, great. Well, we're pretty close to wrapping up here. One thing I thought I would do is, I don't know, Patrick, if you can hear me, if you had a question or anything you wanted to ask, I can click the allow to talk button. There you are. There's your face, and you're muted. Do I have to unmute? No, now you're unmuted.
Hey, Patrick.
Hey, Trevor, thanks so much. Really a lot of great information, a lot of great tactical information throughout the conversation. The question I want to get back to is something that you talked about in terms of leadership. Mm-hmm. And you spoke about confidence in yourself, but also confidence in the message that goes out. And as you're moving up in an organization, your attitude really gets noticed by a lot of people, but sometimes we have some difficult circumstances to deal with. So I'd like you to just kind of talk a little bit about the challenge of having confidence, but also being transparent when you've got some bad news to deliver.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've delivered plenty of bad news. I always err on the side of transparency. And the reason I do is I truly believe people figure it out regardless. So why not tell it themselves? I mean, it's not like there's necessarily this ethical high road or that. I just think that everyone's no secret. I don't know about you, but there's very few secrets that are ever kept in a small company. In a big, huge multinational, yeah, you can keep secrets in certain dark corners of the company. But when you're less than 100 or a couple hundred people, they always get out, especially the juicy bad ones. And I always think I'd rather deliver that than somebody say, why didn't I hear that from Trevor? Why did I hear that from Bob, not from Trevor? So it's kind of more of a pragmatic approach. I always err on the side of transparency. I'm maybe not, I don't know if you guys have followed the Netflix kind of cultural revolution that's gone on, a lot of stuff they've done at Netflix. I love some of that, but I also think they've taken some of the transparency to maybe the too extreme. So I think there's a balance. I mean, certainly transparency that, jeopardizes someone's comfort or safety or anything like that in a company, you need to be careful. But I generally err on the side of more rather than less.
Great. Thank you.
And the other thing is, and this took me a while, this, I don't think anybody is born with this or comes into their career with this but I look back, and I'm not deliberate. I should be more deliberate on this, but I look back at those hard decisions and those delivering bad news or those big game-changing decisions through my career, and it's never as bad as you make it out to be when you're thinking about it, right? Like you dream it up and you dream up worst case, and it never ends up that way. And so I think about the time and the energy and the distraction I spent worrying about worst case, and it just almost never plays out that way. I think whether it's human nature or something, we assume the worst in a lot of cases, and I actually can't think of a single example in my career where that's been the case. So I remind myself of that when I'm coming up these tough decisions, saying, remember those last 6 you had to make? Well, guess what? All 6 turned out better than you thought. So let's maybe frame the discussion around an expected outcome, not a worst case. You don't want to be too optimistic, because then you're not prepared. But being pragmatic and I don't know, game playing it in your head as to what the outcomes could be, and bounding those, I think is helpful.
I have another question for you. Do you have any business heroes, people that you sort of keep track of, or you like to read about, or have philosophies that have sort of motivated you?
Yeah, I think if I had to put one at the top, it would be Bill George from Medtronic. He predated me, so he wasn't the CEO when I was there, but I've read all his stuff. I think he is I don't know if you know kind of his philosophy, but it's very much about authenticity and kind of a moral, a compass by which you run your business. I think what I saw at Medtronic across tens of thousands of people was the manifestation of Bill George's vision and insight. And I really like his perspective on, and I follow him religiously on LinkedIn, and I think he's really, really good. In fact, today he had a LinkedIn post talking about Jeff Immelt from GE, and was kind of critical of him because he didn't follow this moral compass and kind of take ownership for some of the things that happened at GE. So I would put Bill George at the top. I mean, if you ever ask that question, if you could have dinner with anybody alive, who would it be? And he often comes out as kind of the one person I would want to have. I met him briefly and I've seen him talk, and he just exudes kind of all of the traits that I think are most important in a leader. And I think it should be across industry. I feel fortunate that I worked at the company that he was a big driver of. But he's somebody that stood out. And then the other is I'm going to talk about a collection of leaders. So this isn't an individual, but I don't know if you've ever read the book Small Giants.
No. I was going to ask you about a book. So this is great.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So it's a book, and now that I say it, I'm not sure the title's right. It's got a fishbowl on the cover. Anyway, it's a story about, I think, 10 or 12 companies that all chose not to scale and grow for the sake of growth. And I found it fascinating. It was probably one of the most influential books I've read about talking about this role of companies isn't to just mindlessly grow forever. Now, I sound like I'm at odds earlier where I said we want to treat as many patients. I get that. But I really admire people who run businesses for an intent other than maximizing growth and profit. I mean, those kind of are synonymous. But you read the stories of these people, like the one that stands out was Anchorstein Brewery. Like, he decided not to grow when he could have, and the reasons why he didn't do that, why he chose not to grow, made a lot of sense. So I always look back on it just, again, it's kind of in the same light as Bill George, but make decisions that are right for the stakeholders, be it the employees, be it the customers, be it the leadership, whoever. And it's not always about growth, and it's not always about kind of unbridled, expansion. The collection, all of the people that were in that book always stood out to me as people that I admired and would love to emulate in terms of just thought process, being true to themselves and not falling into the group think and being very deliberate. So that would be probably one of the books that I would put on that list.
I got a reading assignment then.
Yeah.
Patrick, any other questions?
No, I think it's been a really, really nice conversation. I've really enjoyed kind of the mix of tactical programs that you're working on and some of the strategic things. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks for attending, Patrick. So With that, I think we'll wrap it up. Do you have any final pieces of advice, Trevor? Or
No, let's just as an industry go treat lots of people.
let's go take care of a lot of patients.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today on this podcast and videocast. It was a lot of fun. And, you and I have already talked twice, but every time we talk, more and more interesting stuff keeps coming out. So this was really interesting and motivating, inspiring, and I'm sure the audience will feel the same way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. And I will welcome kind of continued conversations. I suspect this won't be the last.
Oh, it won't. And I always reserve the right with somebody like you in your situation to talk to you in another year and see where you are.
Absolutely. And then call me on it. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great. Personally, I find these interviews inspiring. Always keep the patient foremost in mind. This is easy to get away from when leading from the C-suite with all the distractions it might have. Trevor has his priorities clearly laid out. It is not only a priority, but a critical value. Even if you're not in the C-suite, you can work according to key business and personal values. Have you and your company reorganized your marketing and sales to respond to the environment the pandemic has created? If not, it is never too late. You could simply start with a sales process, but you will need marketing support. In the show notes, you will find links to Trevor's LinkedIn profile and the TriSalus website. You'll also find some links to me. Thanks again for listening in on our conversation today. If you like this podcast, please rate it, recommend it, and/or subscribe. Now go win your week.